Selfish shrew. Those were the words my own son chose to shout at me in front of 27 relatives at my husband's will reading, and for a moment the entire room went so quiet I could hear the old wall clock ticking behind the lawyer's desk. I remember the sound clearly because it felt louder than anything else in that room, louder than the whispers, louder than the shocked breathing, louder even than the sudden pounding of my own heart. My name is Margaret Collins, I am 72 years old, and until that afternoon I believed I understood my family. The will reading took place in a modest but elegant law office in Hartford, Connecticut, the kind with dark wooden shelves, framed degrees on the walls, and the faint smell of coffee that had been sitting on a warmer too long. Outside, the late autumn sun filtered through tall windows, casting pale golden light across the long conference table where nearly 36 members of the Collins family had gathered. My husband Robert had been gone for just over 3 weeks. 52 years of marriage ended in a quiet hospital room on a rainy Sunday morning, and even now I still expected to hear his slow footsteps in the hallway when I woke up. That afternoon was supposed to be about closure, about honoring the man who had spent half a century building a life for his family. Instead it became something else entirely. I sat near the center of the long table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing the navy dress Robert always said made me look strong and dignified. Across from me sat my son Daniel Collins, 45 years old, broad-shouldered, successful, and looking strangely impatient as the attorney organized several thick folders. Beside him sat his wife Laura, who watched the room with calm eyes and a polite smile that never quite reached her face. Around them were cousins, nieces, nephews, and old family friends who had known Robert for decades. 27 people in total, though at the time it felt like a much larger audience. Everyone spoke in quiet voices while they waited, the way people do when they feel they are standing inside a moment that might matter. Some talked about Robert's career in construction. Others remembered fishing trips, holiday dinners, the summer barbecues he used to host in the backyard of our Connecticut home. The room carried that strange mixture of grief and curiosity that often surrounds the reading of a will. Grief because a life had ended. Curiosity because people wonder what comes next. The lawyer, Richard Blake, had known my husband for more than 20 years. He was a careful man with silver hair and patient eyes, and when he finally cleared his throat the quiet conversations faded almost instantly. He began explaining the formalities, how Robert had updated certain documents a few months before his passing, how the estate had been organized according to state law and family trust agreements. His voice was steady and respectful, and for a while everything felt normal. I listened without interrupting, staring at the polished wood grain of the table while he spoke. Losing Robert had left a silence in my life that I still didn't know how to fill. For more than 5 decades we had built everything together, the small construction company that eventually grew into Collins Construction, the white colonial house on Maple Ridge Road, the savings accounts and investment funds that slowly accumulated through years of long hours and careful decisions. Robert always believed in planning ahead. He used to say a family should never be left confused about the future. That was why he trusted Richard Blake with every legal document we had ever signed. The attorney had just begun opening the first folder when Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back from the table. The sharp scrape of wood against the floor cut through the room like a snapped string. I looked up, surprised. My son rarely made scenes, especially not in front of extended family. For a brief second I thought he might simply need a glass of water or perhaps wanted to ask a question. But then he stood fully upright, shoulders tense, and turned toward me with a look I had never seen before. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was anger, raw and unfiltered. Before we go any further, Daniel said loudly, his voice echoing against the office walls, everyone here deserves to know what kind of person my mother really is. The words hung in the air, confusing and sharp. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone near the end of the table whispered my name under their breath. I felt the weight of 27 pairs of eyes slowly turn toward me. Daniel's face had turned red with emotion, the way it used to when he lost a basketball game as a teenager. Only this time the frustration in his expression carried something darker. Then he pointed straight at me. "Selfish shrew," he shouted, the insult ringing through the room with startling clarity. "That's what she is." For a moment nobody moved. Even the attorney seemed frozen, one hand resting on the open folder in front of him. I noticed Laura reach out and gently touch Daniel's arm, not to stop him but almost as if she were reassuring him that he was right to speak. Around the table a few relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Others stared down at their hands, unwilling to take sides. I could feel the heat rising to my face, yet strangely I did not feel the urge to argue. Perhaps grief had exhausted my ability to react, or perhaps years of experience had taught me that shouting rarely reveals the truth. Instead I simply sat there, breathing slowly, letting the silence return. In that silence I remembered another image of my son, a much younger Daniel running across the backyard of our first house with grass stains on his jeans and a baseball glove dangling from his hand. Back then he used to call me the strongest person he knew. Families change in ways that often go unnoticed until a single moment reveals everything. That afternoon, standing in a quiet law office surrounded by 27 witnesses, my son believed he was exposing the truth about me. What he didn't know was that Robert Collins had spent the last months of his life preparing for exactly this moment. The word my son had just shouted still seemed to echo inside the quiet law office even though several seconds had already passed. Selfish shrew. I watched Daniel standing there beside his chair, breathing heavily, his shoulders tight with a kind of anger that felt strangely rehearsed rather than sudden. Around the table the room had become painfully still. A cousin near the far end lowered his eyes. One of Robert's older sisters pressed her lips together as if she was unsure whether she should say something. No one spoke. Even the hum of the heating vent seemed to fade. Richard Blake, the attorney, slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table in front of him. He was a patient man, but even patience has its limits, and I could see the careful concern in his expression as he looked from Daniel to me and then around the room at the rest of the family. Daniel did not sit back down. Instead he crossed his arms as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Laura remained seated beside him, her posture composed, her hands still lightly touching his sleeve. She was not smiling, but there was something steady in her expression that made it clear she was not surprised by what had just happened. I lowered my eyes briefly to the table, not out of shame but simply to steady my thoughts. Losing Robert had left me with a strange sense of quiet distance from everything around me. For weeks my life had felt like a house where the furniture remained but the warmth had disappeared. And yet even in that numbness I understood that something far more complicated than grief had brought us all into that room. Daniel spoke again, his voice lower now but still sharp. He said that everyone there had spent years believing I was the heart of the Collins family, the devoted wife who stood beside Robert while he built the company, the mother who supposedly sacrificed everything for her son. According to him, that image was a lie. He said that behind closed doors I had controlled Robert's decisions, that I had isolated him from his own relatives, that I cared more about money than about family. Each accusation landed in the air like a stone dropped into water, sending quiet ripples through the room. I noticed a few relatives glance toward Laura before looking back at Daniel. I had lived long enough to recognize when a story had been carefully repeated many times before it was spoken in public. Richard Blake raised one hand gently, the way a teacher might signal a classroom to settle down. He said that the purpose of the gathering was to read Robert Collins's will and to explain the legal structure of the estate. Personal arguments, he reminded everyone, would not change the contents of a signed document. Daniel gave a short laugh that did not sound amused. He said the document was exactly the problem. According to him, Robert had been manipulated during the final years of his life, and the will we were about to hear would prove it. I could feel the attention of the entire room shift toward the folders on the table. People who had arrived expecting a routine legal reading now sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Laura finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. She said that Daniel only wanted transparency and fairness for everyone in the family. She said that after Robert's passing it was important for relatives to understand how certain decisions had been made. The words sounded reasonable, almost comforting, yet there was a careful precision to them that made it obvious she had chosen each one deliberately. I did not interrupt. Instead I folded my hands again and allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer. My husband had spent 52 years teaching me that patience often reveals more than anger ever could. Eventually Daniel sat down again, though the tension in his posture did not fade. Richard Blake waited until the room had settled before putting his glasses back on. He opened the first folder again and began explaining that Robert Collins had updated his estate documents 3 months before his death. That statement immediately drew attention because several relatives exchanged surprised looks. Most people in the family believed the will had not been changed for years. Daniel leaned forward slightly, as if he had been expecting exactly that announcement. His expression carried a kind of confidence that suggested he believed the next few minutes would confirm everything he had just accused me of. I watched him carefully, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from me with the boy who once asked me for advice about every important decision in his life. Somewhere along the way that trust had quietly disappeared. The attorney continued speaking in his calm, methodical tone. He explained that Robert had established a detailed estate plan many years earlier but had decided to revise several elements recently. The revisions, he said, had been made voluntarily and had been signed in the presence of legal witnesses. No one interrupted him this time. The room had grown so quiet that even the faint rustle of paper sounded unusually loud. Richard Blake lifted a second sealed envelope from the folder and placed it gently on the table. He said that Robert had left very specific instructions regarding when that envelope should be opened. According to those instructions, it was to be read only after all immediate family members were present together. A few relatives shifted in their seats. Daniel looked briefly at Laura, then back at the envelope. The confidence in his expression remained, but for the first time I noticed a hint of uncertainty flicker across his face. I sat there silently, remembering the final conversation Robert and I had shared in our living room not long before he went into the hospital. At the time I did not fully understand why he had spoken with such careful seriousness about the future. Now, watching the sealed envelope resting on the polished wood table while 27 members of our extended family waited for the lawyer to open it, I finally realized that my husband had not simply written a will. He had prepared something else entirely. I watched Richard Blake rest his hand on the sealed envelope for a moment before opening it, as if he understood that whatever was inside would change the atmosphere of the room completely. 27 relatives sat around the long conference table in absolute silence, their attention fixed on the document that Robert Collins had chosen to leave behind. The late afternoon light had shifted slightly through the tall windows, casting long pale lines across the polished wood surface of the table. For a brief moment I found myself thinking about how many evenings Robert and I had spent sitting at our kitchen table discussing the future of our family, the future of our company, and the responsibility that comes with building something that lasts longer than one lifetime. Richard carefully slid a letter from the envelope and unfolded it slowly. The paper looked ordinary, but I recognized Robert's handwriting immediately even from across the table. My husband had always written with the same steady style he used when signing contracts for Collins Construction, precise and deliberate. The attorney cleared his throat and explained that the document was a personal statement Robert had asked to be read before the rest of the will. He said that Robert believed it would help the family understand the reasoning behind certain decisions. Daniel leaned forward in his chair with his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Laura remained composed beside him, though her eyes never left the paper in the attorney's hands. Around the table several relatives exchanged curious glances. No one expected a personal letter. The attorney began reading in a calm voice. The letter opened with Robert addressing the family directly, thanking everyone for gathering together and expressing his hope that the meeting would be handled with respect. Then the tone shifted slightly. Robert wrote that during the final years of his life he had observed growing tension inside the family, tension that he believed could eventually damage both personal relationships and the future of the company he had spent decades building. As those words were read aloud I noticed a few relatives shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The attorney continued. Robert explained that Collins Construction had never simply been a business to him. It had been the product of long days, sleepless nights, and countless risks taken when the company was nothing more than a small operation with one truck and a handful of tools. He wrote that every brick laid and every contract signed had been done with one purpose in mind, creating stability for the family he loved. I felt a quiet warmth pass through me hearing those words because they sounded exactly like the man I had lived beside for 52 years. But then the letter took another turn. Robert wrote that building a company is difficult, but protecting a family can be even more complicated. He said that over time people sometimes begin to see success not as something to preserve but as something to claim. The room remained silent as the attorney read each sentence carefully. Daniel shifted in his seat again and glanced toward Laura briefly before looking back at the letter. Robert's message continued by explaining that because of those concerns he had spent the last year working closely with legal advisors to restructure the estate and the company in a way that would prevent conflict. According to the letter, the goal was not to punish anyone but to protect what had been built. Richard Blake paused briefly and then looked around the room before continuing. Robert had written that certain accusations might one day be made about Margaret Collins. Hearing my name spoken in that calm legal voice caused several heads to turn toward me again. Robert's letter explained that if such accusations ever appeared, they should be viewed carefully because the person who knew Margaret best was the man who had shared his entire life with her. A few relatives lowered their eyes after hearing that line. Daniel's posture stiffened, but he did not interrupt. The attorney continued reading. Robert described Margaret Collins as the partner who had supported him through every uncertain year of building the company, the person who handled the family finances when business was unstable, and the person who made sacrifices so that he could focus on work. He wrote that the success of Collins' construction belonged to both of them equally. For a brief moment I noticed Daniel's expression shift slightly as if he had not expected that part of the letter. Laura remained perfectly still beside him. The letter then addressed the future. Robert wrote that family disagreements are sometimes unavoidable, but greed and misunderstanding can destroy generations of effort if they are not carefully prevented. Because of that risk, he had created a legal structure designed to remove control from emotional arguments and place it in stable hands. The attorney lowered the paper for a moment and explained that the remainder of the letter directly referenced the trust structure that Robert had created several months earlier. At this point the room felt heavier than before, as if everyone present sensed that the explanation was leading somewhere important. Daniel uncrossed his arms slowly and leaned closer to the table. Laura's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her chair. The attorney resumed reading the final lines of the letter. Robert wrote that when the time came for his estate to be discussed, there might be voices claiming authority or demanding control. Those voices, he said, should not decide the future of the company or the family legacy. Instead, the responsibility should belong to the one person who had proven loyalty and judgment over the course of half a century. When Richard Blake reached that sentence, he paused once again and looked directly at the table before continuing. Every person in the room seemed to lean forward slightly without realizing it. Even the distant hum of the building ventilation sounded louder in the quiet. Robert's final sentence was simple. He wrote that everything he had built was protected inside a family trust, and the trustee responsible for guarding it was Margaret Collins. For the first time since Daniel had shouted across the room earlier that afternoon, I allowed myself to lift my head and look directly at my son. The silence that followed felt deeper than anything that had come before. The silence that followed the final line of Robert's letter was so complete that for several seconds no one in the room even shifted in their chairs. 27 relatives sat frozen around the long conference table while the meaning of those words slowly settled over them. Margaret Collins, trustee of the entire Collins family trust. I could feel the attention of the room pressing toward me like the weight of a sudden spotlight, yet I did not move. My hands remained folded calmly in my lap just as they had been when Daniel shouted across the table earlier that afternoon. The only difference now was the expression on my son's face. The anger that had filled his voice minutes earlier had been replaced by something more complicated, something uncertain. Daniel looked first at the attorney, then at the letter resting on the table, and finally back at me. For the first time since he stood up and called me a selfish shrew, he seemed unsure of what to say next. Richard Blake allowed the silence to linger for a moment before carefully setting Robert's letter aside. He explained that the document we had just heard was not the will itself but rather an introduction Robert wanted the family to hear before the legal details were discussed. The trust structure, he said, had been created to ensure that Collins' construction and all related assets would remain stable regardless of personal disagreements inside the family. His voice remained calm and professional, but I noticed several relatives exchanging glances that carried a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he were trying to steady himself. He asked the attorney what exactly it meant for me to be the trustee. His tone was no longer loud, but it carried the same sharp edge that had filled the room earlier. Richard Blake nodded politely, as if he had expected the question. He explained that a trustee holds legal authority over a trust, meaning the person in that role is responsible for managing the assets according to the instructions written by the individual who created it. In this case, Robert Collins had placed the company, the house on Maple Ridge Road, and several investment accounts inside the trust. Those assets would not pass directly into anyone else's hands. Instead, they would be managed by the trustee for the benefit of the family and the long-term stability of the business. The explanation seemed to ripple through the room slowly as people absorbed its meaning. One of Robert's cousins cleared his throat quietly. Another relative shifted in his chair and looked toward Daniel as if waiting for his reaction. Daniel asked the attorney whether that meant he had no authority over the company his father built. Richard Blake answered carefully. He said that Robert had created a structure designed to prevent sudden changes in leadership during periods of emotional stress. Because of that structure, control of the trust belonged solely to Margaret Collins. I noticed Laura finally lean forward slightly beside Daniel. Her calm expression had not disappeared, but the confidence that once rested there had faded just enough to reveal a flicker of concern. She asked whether the trust could be modified now that Robert was gone. The attorney shook his head gently and explained that the terms had been written to remain stable for many years. Any changes would require the trustee's approval. The words settled over the room slowly, and I could almost feel the direction of the conversation shifting. Minutes earlier Daniel had stood up as if he expected to expose some hidden wrongdoing. Now the attention of every relative present had turned toward the quiet widow sitting at the center of the table. I lifted my eyes calmly and looked across at my son. There was a time when Daniel would have understood my silence as patience. Over the years something had changed in the way he interpreted my calm. Perhaps he had mistaken it for weakness. Perhaps someone had helped him believe that story. Families do not fall apart overnight. Most of the time the distance grows quietly, one misunderstanding at a time. I remembered the afternoon when Daniel first introduced Laura to Robert and me nearly 10 years earlier. She had been charming and thoughtful that day, asking questions about the early years of the company and listening closely while Robert described how he started with nothing more than a pickup truck and a few construction tools. At the time I believed she admired the history of the family business. Over time the conversation slowly shifted. Laura began asking Daniel why he was not more involved in management decisions. She wondered why Robert continued to consult me about finances and long-term planning. None of those questions seemed unreasonable by themselves. Yet together they slowly changed the way Daniel looked at our family's history. Now, sitting in the quiet law office while 27 relatives waited for the attorney to continue reading, I could see the result of those years clearly written across my son's face. Daniel spoke again, though his voice carried less certainty than before. He asked whether the rest of the will would explain how the trust was supposed to operate in the future. Richard Blake nodded and opened another folder. He explained that Robert had left detailed instructions describing how the company should be managed and how future profits would be distributed among family members. Those instructions, however, would only be followed under the supervision of the trustee. As he said those words, the attorney glanced toward me briefly, not with surprise but with quiet acknowledgement. Around the table several relatives shifted in their chairs again, and I sensed that many of them were beginning to reconsider the accusations Daniel had shouted earlier. I did not interrupt or defend myself. Robert had always believed that truth reveals itself best when people are given time to see it clearly. The afternoon light outside the windows had grown softer, and the quiet office felt almost like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written long before anyone arrived. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, the tension still visible in his posture but no longer supported by the confidence he carried earlier. Laura remained beside him, silent now, her eyes focused on the open folders resting on the attorney's desk. Richard Blake prepared to continue reading the legal details of the estate, but before he spoke again he looked around the room and said calmly that Robert Collins had anticipated disagreements inside the family. That was precisely why he had spent the final months of his life ensuring that the future of Collins Construction would not depend on anger, accusations, or misunderstandings. It would depend on stability, patience, and the judgment of the person he trusted most. As those words settled into the quiet room, I realized something important. Robert had not simply left behind a will. He had left behind a test of character, and that test had already begun. I did not speak immediately after the attorney finished explaining the structure of the trust. The room had shifted into a different kind of silence now, the kind that comes when people realize the story they believed a few minutes earlier may not be the real one. I could see it in the way several relatives avoided looking directly at Daniel. Others watched him carefully, waiting to see how he would respond now that the ground beneath his accusations had changed. Richard Blake adjusted the papers in front of him and continued speaking in the same calm voice that had guided the meeting from the beginning. He explained that Robert Collins had not only created a trust but had also written a series of instructions describing how decisions regarding Collins construction should be made over the next 20 years. According to those instructions, the company would continue operating under its current management team while the trustees supervised major financial decisions. The goal, Robert had written, was to protect the stability of the business and the employees who depended on it. When the attorney mentioned the employees, I noticed a small detail that many people in the room might have missed. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Collins Construction employed more than 80 workers across several projects throughout Connecticut. Robert had always said that those men and women were part of the extended Collins family because their livelihoods were tied to the decisions made by our household. I had spent years reviewing payroll reports and insurance documents late at night with Robert, making sure that every worker received fair treatment and reliable paychecks. That responsibility was never something Daniel showed much interest in while he was growing up. My son cleared his throat and asked a new question. He wanted to know whether the trustee had the authority to appoint someone else to run the company in the future. Richard Blake answered carefully, explaining that the trust allowed the trustee to appoint or remove executives if it became necessary for the protection of the company. However, such decisions would require careful evaluation of the business and its leadership. Daniel nodded slowly, though the frustration in his expression had not disappeared. Laura finally spoke again after several minutes of silence. She asked whether the trust specified how profits from the company would be distributed among family members. Her tone was polite, but I recognized the careful attention behind the question. Financial distribution had always been the center of Daniel and Laura's concerns during the last few years of Robert's life. The attorney opened another document and explained that Robert had addressed that topic in detail. Annual profits from Collins Construction would be divided into several categories. A portion would remain inside the company for future development. Another portion would support long-term investment accounts designed to strengthen the trust itself. The remaining portion would be distributed among family beneficiaries according to a schedule Robert had written himself. Several relatives leaned forward slightly when they heard that explanation. Money has a way of sharpening attention even in the quietest rooms. Daniel asked whether he was listed as one of those beneficiaries. Richard Blake confirmed that he was. However, the attorney added one important detail. According to the trust agreement, all beneficiaries would receive distributions only under the supervision and approval of the trustee. I noticed Laura glance at Daniel again. The two of them did not speak, but their shared look carried a quiet understanding that the situation unfolding in the room was not following the path they had expected. Around the table a few relatives whispered softly to one another. The earlier accusation that Daniel had shouted across the room now seemed distant, almost out of place in the calm legal explanation that continued to unfold. I sat quietly while the attorney described the remaining elements of the trust. The house on Maple Ridge Road had also been placed inside the structure. That house had been our home for more than 30 years, the place where Daniel grew up and where Robert and I celebrated countless holidays with friends and family. Robert had written that the house should remain available to family members for gatherings and events so long as it continued to be maintained responsibly. Hearing those words brought a brief image back to my mind of a summer evening many years earlier when Daniel was still a teenager. Robert had been standing beside the backyard grill telling stories about his early construction jobs while cousins played basketball in the driveway. Back then our family felt simple and connected. I wondered if Daniel remembered those evenings the same way I did. The attorney continued reading the final pages describing the trust structure. He explained that Robert had designed the system to last for many years, allowing future generations of the Collins family to benefit from the stability of the company without allowing sudden personal conflicts to dismantle it. When Richard Blake finished speaking, he placed the final document on the table and looked calmly around the room. No one spoke for several seconds. The explanation had been detailed and thorough, leaving little room for misunderstanding. Daniel sat very still in his chair. The anger that once filled his voice earlier in the afternoon had been replaced by a more complicated expression that looked almost like quiet calculation. Laura remained composed beside him, though the confidence she carried at the beginning of the meeting had softened into thoughtful silence. Finally Daniel looked toward me again. His voice was controlled now, but the question he asked carried the weight of everything that had happened in the room that day. He asked whether I intended to keep full control of the trust exactly as Robert had written it. For a moment every person present seemed to wait for my answer. I lifted my head slowly and met my son's eyes across the table. For years Daniel had believed that I preferred silence because I was afraid of conflict. In truth, I had remained silent because Robert and I both understood that time reveals character more clearly than arguments ever could. Now the moment Robert had prepared for had finally arrived, and every person in that quiet office was beginning to understand that the story unfolding in front of them was far more complicated than the accusation Daniel had shouted only an hour earlier. The room remained silent after Daniel asked his question, and I could feel the attention of every person present waiting for my response. For a moment I did not answer. I simply studied my son across the table, noticing the small lines of tension near his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the polished wood surface before becoming still again. Daniel had always been an impatient man. Even as a child he disliked waiting for answers. When he was 8 years old he once spent an entire afternoon asking Robert how long it took to build a house because he could not understand why anything important required time. Robert had laughed gently that day and told him that strong foundations are never rushed. Now, sitting in the quiet law office decades later, I wondered whether Daniel remembered that lesson. I finally spoke, my voice calm and steady in the same way Robert used to speak when he addressed his construction crews at the beginning of a project. I said that Robert had trusted me with the responsibility of the trust because he believed stability mattered more than personal pride. The trust existed to protect the company, the house, and the family from decisions made in anger or confusion. I explained that my role as trustee was not about control. It was about stewardship. Several relatives nodded quietly as they listened. Daniel did not interrupt, but I could see that he was measuring every word carefully. Laura sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, watching me with the same thoughtful expression she had worn since the attorney finished reading the trust documents. Richard Blake leaned back slightly in his chair, allowing the conversation to continue naturally without stepping in. I continued speaking because the moment Robert had prepared for had finally arrived. I reminded Daniel that Collins Construction was not simply a financial asset. It represented decades of labor, the efforts of dozens of employees, and the trust of clients who had relied on our company to build homes, schools, and small businesses across Connecticut. Decisions about that company could not be made lightly. They required patience, careful planning, and respect for the people whose livelihoods depended on it. Daniel listened without speaking, though his expression remained tense. After a moment he asked whether the trust meant he would never have the opportunity to lead the company his father had built. His question carried a different tone now, less accusatory and more uncertain. I answered honestly. I said that the trust did not forbid him from becoming involved in the future. What it required was preparation and responsibility. Leadership inside Collins Construction would always belong to the person best prepared to protect the business and the people who worked for it. Around the table several relatives shifted in their seats again, sensing that the conversation had moved away from accusation and towards something more thoughtful. Laura finally spoke once more. She asked whether the trust documents explained how that preparation would be evaluated. Her question sounded practical, but I recognized the deeper concern behind it. Richard Blake leaned forward and opened another folder. He explained that Robert had written a detailed section describing how family members could become eligible for leadership roles within the company. According to those instructions, any future executive must demonstrate experience in construction management, financial oversight, and long-term project planning. Robert had believed that the company should always be led by someone who understood the business from the ground up. Hearing those words caused a quiet reaction among several relatives because many of them knew that Daniel had never spent much time working inside the company itself. My son had chosen a different career path after college, focusing on marketing and consulting projects in other cities. None of that work was dishonorable, but it meant that he had not developed the practical experience Robert valued most in a construction leader. Daniel looked down at the documents for a moment before asking another question. He wanted to know whether the trust allowed the trustee to mentor a future successor. Richard Blake nodded and confirmed that it did. The trustee had full authority to guide and evaluate any family member interested in eventually taking on greater responsibility. As those words settled into the room, a different kind of possibility began to take shape in the minds of those listening. I could see it in the way a few relatives leaned forward again, no longer focused on the earlier accusation but on the path Robert had quietly designed for the future. Daniel slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me again. The anger that had fueled his outburst earlier in the afternoon had faded, replaced by a mixture of frustration and reflection. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not speak immediately. Instead, he seemed to be reconsidering everything that had happened in the last hour. Laura glanced toward him briefly but remained silent. The room itself felt calmer now, as if the storm that Daniel tried to start had already passed and left behind something clearer. Richard Blake placed his hands together on the table and said gently that Robert Collins had believed family disagreements should not be settled through shouting or suspicion. They should be resolved through patience, honesty, and time. As those words echoed softly in the quiet office, I realized that Robert had not only prepared legal documents. He had prepared a path forward for the family. Whether Daniel would choose to walk that path was a decision only he could make. Daniel did not answer immediately after the attorney finished speaking, and the quiet that followed felt different from the earlier silence in the room. It was no longer the tense stillness of confrontation. Instead, it felt like the kind of pause that appears when people realize they may have misunderstood something important. I watched my son carefully across the long conference table. His shoulders had lowered slightly, and the rigid anger that had shaped his posture earlier had begun to loosen. Yet the conflict inside him had not disappeared. It was visible in the way his eyes moved between me, the attorney, and the documents spread across the polished wood surface. Laura sat beside him in composed silence, but I noticed the thoughtful tension in her expression as well. She was a perceptive woman, and she clearly understood that the direction of the meeting had changed in ways she had not anticipated. Around us, several relatives shifted in their chairs as the atmosphere slowly softened. A cousin near the far end of the table leaned back and folded his hands, studying Daniel with quiet curiosity. Another relative whispered something to his wife before falling silent again. Richard Blake allowed the room to settle before speaking once more. He explained that Robert Collins believed family members should have opportunities to grow into responsibility rather than being handed authority before they were ready. Because of that belief, the trust structure included a process through which any interested family member could become involved with Collins' construction over time. This process required education, hands-on experience, and participation in the daily operations of the company. The attorney described how Robert had written that the next generation must understand the work itself before guiding the people who perform it. Hearing those words brought a faint memory back to me of Robert standing on a muddy construction site nearly 30 years earlier explaining to a young project manager why every foundation must be inspected carefully before the first wall is raised. He used to say that mistakes hidden beneath the surface eventually reveal themselves when it is too late to fix them easily. Daniel listened quietly while the attorney explained these details. The frustration that once pushed him to shout across the room had slowly transformed into something more reflective. Finally he spoke again. But his voice carried none of the anger that had filled the office earlier. He asked what exactly Robert expected from a family member who wished to become involved in the company's future leadership. Richard Blake opened another document and read a section that Robert had written personally. According to those instructions, any future leader from within the Collins family would need to spend several years working alongside project supervisors, learning how contracts were negotiated, how construction timelines were planned, and how financial decisions affected both workers and clients. The goal, Robert wrote, was to ensure that leadership always remained connected to the real work happening on job sites across the state. Several relatives nodded quietly while the attorney spoke. Collins Construction had built dozens of homes, office buildings, and schools across Connecticut over the decades, and many people in that room had seen firsthand how much effort went into every completed project. Daniel sat silently for several moments after hearing those words. I could see him processing the idea that the path his father had created was not a barrier but an invitation to learn. Laura glanced at him once, her expression thoughtful rather than encouraging or discouraging. For the first time since the meeting began, Daniel looked less like a man defending an accusation and more like someone reconsidering his place within the family story. The afternoon sunlight outside the tall windows had softened into the pale gold of early evening, and the quiet office felt almost reflective. Finally Daniel spoke again, his voice steady but noticeably quieter than before. He said that he had spent the last several years building his own career in marketing and consulting, believing that success in those fields would prepare him to take over the company one day. He admitted that he had assumed leadership would eventually be passed to him automatically. When he finished speaking, he looked toward the attorney and then toward me again. His expression carried a mixture of embarrassment and uncertainty. Richard Blake responded calmly. He explained that Robert respected Daniel's professional achievements but believed leadership inside a construction company required direct experience within the industry itself. The trust was not designed to exclude Daniel. It was designed to ensure that whoever eventually guided Collins Construction understood its responsibilities completely. A quiet murmur moved through the room as relatives absorbed the meaning of those words. I remained silent. For a moment, studying my son across the table. There was a time when Daniel would have understood this lesson immediately. As a boy he used to follow Robert around construction sites wearing an oversized hard hat, asking endless questions about tools and blueprints. Somewhere between those early days and the present moment, the distance between us had quietly grown. Families rarely notice such changes while they are happening. They only recognize them when circumstances force everyone to look honestly at one another. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair, releasing a slow breath. The sharp certainty that fueled his earlier accusation had faded entirely. In its place was something more complicated but also more hopeful. The room remained quiet, but the tension that once filled it had gradually transformed into reflection. Robert had anticipated that this moment might come. He had written his trust not simply to protect a company but to give the next generation time to understand what responsibility truly meant. Sitting there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by relatives who had witnessed the entire exchange, I realized that the future Robert prepared was beginning to reveal itself step by step. For several moments after Daniel leaned back in his chair, no one in the room spoke. The quiet felt different now, calmer, almost thoughtful, as if everyone present had begun to understand that the story unfolding that afternoon was not the simple conflict Daniel had tried to create earlier. I watched my son carefully across the table. The anger that once filled his expression had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of quiet reflection. His eyes moved slowly over the documents in front of him, then toward the window where the late afternoon light had softened into the warm tones of early evening. Outside, traffic along the Hartford Street below moved steadily, unaware that inside the law office an entire family was reconsidering its future. Richard Blake allowed the silence to linger before gently closing one of the folders in front of him. He explained that the formal legal reading of the will had now been completed and that the remaining documents simply confirmed the structure already described. Collins Construction would continue operating under its existing management team while the trustees supervised major decisions and ensured that the company followed the principles Robert Collins had written into the trust. Several relatives nodded quietly, absorbing the explanation. One of Robert's cousins cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since the earlier argument. He said that Robert had always been a careful planner and that the structure of the trust sounded exactly like something he would design. Another relative agreed softly, remembering how Robert used to review financial reports late at night even after long days at construction sites. The room gradually began to feel less like a courtroom and more like a family gathering again. Daniel remained quiet while the conversation shifted around him. I could see that he was thinking carefully about everything he had heard. The accusations he had shouted earlier that afternoon now seemed distant, almost unreal compared to the calm explanation that followed. After several minutes he finally spoke again. His voice was steady, but there was a humility in it that had not been there before. He said that when he arrived at the meeting he believed the trust would prove that his father had been influenced or manipulated during the final months of his life. Instead, he now realized that Robert had spent that time preparing something much more thoughtful. Daniel admitted that he had underestimated the complexity of the decisions Robert had made. Hearing those words caused a quiet shift in the room. Several relatives glanced toward me, perhaps expecting some reaction. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I simply looked at my son with the same calm patience that Robert often showed when teaching younger employees how to read construction plans. Laura sat beside Daniel, listening carefully. For the first time since the meeting began, her expression carried something closer to respect than calculation. She asked whether the trust allowed Daniel to begin learning the business even though he had not worked in construction before. Richard Blake answered that the trust specifically encouraged family members to become involved if they were willing to learn and demonstrate responsibility. The process, however, would require time and genuine commitment. Robert had believed that leadership should grow from experience rather than entitlement. Daniel nodded slowly while absorbing those words. I could see the weight of the moment settling into him. The confident assumptions he carried into the room earlier had dissolved, replaced by a clearer understanding of the responsibility attached to the Collins family legacy. Around the table, several relatives relaxed slightly in their chairs, sensing that the tension of the afternoon had finally begun to resolve. One of Robert's sisters spoke quietly, saying that Robert always believed families become stronger when they choose patience over pride. Her comment caused a few gentle smiles to appear around the room. I allowed myself a small breath, feeling the heaviness of the earlier conflict slowly fade. Daniel then looked directly at me again, and the expression in his eyes was no longer defensive. Instead, it carried the seriousness of someone realizing that his actions had consequences beyond a single argument. He said that earlier he had allowed frustration and misunderstanding to guide his words. He admitted that shouting across the room had not been the right way to handle the situation. The apology was not dramatic or emotional, but it was sincere. The room remained quiet as he spoke. I studied my son for a moment before answering. I told him that families sometimes lose their way when grief and uncertainty cloud their judgment. What mattered was whether people were willing to correct their course once the truth became clear. Collins Construction had survived decades of economic changes, difficult projects, and unexpected setbacks because Robert always insisted that problems should be solved with patience and honesty rather than pride. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. Outside the windows, the sunlight had nearly faded, leaving the office illuminated by the soft overhead lights. The atmosphere that once felt tense now felt reflective. Richard Blake gathered the remaining documents into a neat stack and explained that copies of the trust instructions would be provided to the immediate family members so that everyone could understand the structure Robert had created. As he finished speaking, I realized that the afternoon had quietly transformed from confrontation into something closer to understanding. Robert had anticipated the possibility of conflict, but he had also believed that time and clarity could guide the family back toward cooperation. Sitting there in the quiet law office surrounded by relatives who had witnessed the entire exchange, I could see that his careful planning had done exactly that. The future of Collins Construction would not be decided by a moment of anger. It would be shaped by the choices our family made after the truth had been revealed. The quiet conversation in the law office continued for several minutes after Daniel finished speaking, but the atmosphere had changed completely from the moment he stood up. Earlier that afternoon, the tension that once filled the room had softened into something calmer, almost reflective. Several relatives began speaking quietly among themselves, sharing memories of Robert and recalling the early years of Collins Construction when the company was still small and uncertain. Richard Blake carefully organized the final documents into a neat stack and explained that the legal portion of the meeting was officially complete. Copies of the trust instructions would be distributed to immediate family members so that everyone could review Robert's decisions in detail. His calm voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had worked beside Robert for many years and understood the thoughtfulness behind every line of the documents. I sat still for a moment longer, watching the room slowly return to the natural rhythm of conversation. Daniel remained seated across from me, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive now. The anger that had driven him to shout earlier had completely faded, replaced by a seriousness that seemed far more genuine. Laura sat beside him in silence, her posture relaxed for the first time since the meeting began. The soft light from the ceiling fixtures reflected gently off the polished wood table, and for a moment I noticed how ordinary the room looked now compared to the tension that had filled it earlier. Daniel finally stood up from his chair. The movement caused several relatives to glance in his direction again, perhaps remembering how suddenly he had stood before. This time his posture was different. There was no anger in it, only quiet intention. He walked slowly around the table until he stood a few feet away from me. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. I could see the mixture of regret and determination in his eyes, the look of a man realizing that a single afternoon had changed the way he understood his family. He said that when he arrived at the will reading he believed he was defending his father's legacy. He had convinced himself that Robert must have been influenced during the final months of his life. Instead, he now understood that his father had been planning carefully for the future while the rest of us were still focused on the present. Daniel admitted that his anger had come from misunderstanding rather than truth. The room remained silent while he spoke, and I noticed several relatives watching the moment with quiet attention. When he finished, he did not offer dramatic gestures or emotional speeches. Instead he simply said that he hoped to earn the opportunity to learn the business his father had built. The sincerity in his voice reminded me briefly of the young boy who once followed Robert across construction sites asking questions about blueprints and foundations. I stood slowly from my chair as well, not because the room expected it but because the moment deserved acknowledgement. I told Daniel that responsibility is rarely given all at once. It grows slowly through experience, patience, and the willingness to listen. Robert understood that better than anyone I have ever known. The trust he created was not meant to divide the family or prevent anyone from participating in the future of Collins construction. It was designed to protect the company until the next generation was ready to guide it wisely. Daniel nodded quietly as he listened. Laura stepped forward slightly beside him and said that both of them understood now why Robert had written the trust the way he did. She admitted that the complexity of the company had been easy to underestimate from the outside. Around us the rest of the relatives watched the exchange with quiet approval. The earlier conflict had turned into something much more meaningful. Richard Blake finally closed the last folder and placed it carefully into his briefcase. He said that Robert Collins had once told him a strong building stands not only because of the materials used to construct it but because of the people who maintain it over time. The same principle, he believed, applied to families. Those words seemed to settle gently over the room. Outside the windows the evening sky had darkened completely, and the streetlights below cast soft reflections against the glass. One by one relatives began gathering their coats and preparing to leave, offering quiet words of support to Daniel as they passed. The law office gradually emptied until only a few of us remained. Daniel stood beside me for a moment longer before speaking again. He said that if the opportunity existed, he would like to begin learning about the company properly, starting wherever the process required. His voice carried determination now rather than expectation. I looked at him carefully and saw something I had not seen earlier that day. For the first time in many years my son appeared ready to listen rather than assume. I told him that Collins Construction had always welcomed those willing to learn from the ground up. Robert had started the company with a pickup truck, a toolbox, and more determination than experience. Anyone who respected that journey would always have a place to begin. Daniel nodded again, understanding that the future Robert prepared would not be rushed. It would be built step by step, just as every strong foundation is built. As we walked out of the quiet law office together, I realized that the meeting Robert had arranged was never simply about a will. It was about revealing the truth at exactly the moment our family needed it most. The accusation that once echoed through the room had lost its power. In its place remained something far more important, the chance for the Collins family to move forward with clarity, responsibility, and the patience Robert had always believed in.